Welcome to Clydebuilt Conversations by Clydebuilt International. Today's guest is former Secretary of State George Shultz. We spoke about his life, his career, his views on leadership, and the role of the United States in the world. We spoke at Secretary Shultz's Stanford University office. Secretary Shultz, thank you so much for being with Clydebuilt Conversations today. We so appreciate your time, and I personally am someone who so looks up to your leadership. You have had a remarkable career and have been a real personal example to me and so many others through your career of a leader who is thoughtful, as a leader who has the attribute of wisdom and care and consideration for other people. And so it's a real pleasure to be able to sit with you and talk with you about your career, your observations about leadership, and that example that you have been to so many. So thank you for taking time today. And I would also say your wife Charlotte has done so much in the area, and so I almost wish she could be here in a way, but she herself has been such a wonderful leader for San Francisco and that community, so thank you to her. Tell me about your early years in Englewood, New Jersey. Tell me about that period of time in the New Jersey and the New York area in the 1920s and 1930s, which were your younger years. You were growing up. Describe that period of your life in the 20s and 30s in New Jersey and New York.
That was a period dominated by the Great Depression. My father worked in the New York Stock Exchange. And in those days, you had a 5.5-day week. So he frequently would take me in with him on Saturday. So I'd hang around the office and I got to talk to people and listen to them. It was interesting to me that one of the big investment gurus, Ben Graham, and I had a chance to be a lot with him. He was not really thinking about standard investment things that he wrote about. He was worrying about the war in Europe and what it would do. In other words, it suddenly dawned on me the connection between the big picture and the smaller picture. But my father was wonderful with me as a boy. He knew a lot about how the stock exchange worked. In San Francisco, they wanted to start one, so they asked him to come out and help him. So he took me along as an 8-year-old boy. We traveled across the country on trains. We stopped at the Grand Canyon. We stopped in Salt Lake. I remember swimming in the Salt Lake. You couldn't sink.
Yes.
And coming to San Francisco. And there's a nice picture of my father and I at Keyser Stadium, which was then the big sports center in San Francisco. But the point of this story is that my father was a teacher without even being one. He just exposed me to things and pointing things out. And I think it had a lot to do with my attitude.
And your mother as well, is she Margaret Lennox?
Margaret Lennox.
And your father was Burl Shultz?
Earl Shultz.
Yes. And so she also had a significant impact.
Yeah, she was wonderful. There's a picture of her right there.
Oh, lovely. Lovely.
So I had very loving parents.
Yes.
Who taught me and saw that I was exposed to things from which I could learn.
Yes.
So that was very helpful to me. And then, of course, Princeton
Yes.
had the motto, Princeton, the nation's service.
Yes.
And I studied economics, but I also was part of what was called, at the time, the School of Public and International Affairs. It's now called the Wilson Center. But anyway, you took on various problems, and so you got some idea of policy and what it was made of.
And you recently said, this is quoting you, you said that my theme is that you may know a lot about a lot, but it's what you learn from experience that gives you a realization of how things really work. And what did you mean by that? Elaborate
Well, I
on that.
think you can know a lot, but a deeper understanding means you realize what's happening and why,
Mm.
in a broader sense.
Mm-hmm.
So I always tell a story about a time in an MIT faculty meeting when a new person got up and said how pleased he was to be a member of the faculty, showed what the administration thought of him, what his colleagues thought of him. He said, maybe it'd be interesting what a couple of the old timers in a little town in Maine where I grew up think. But a couple are sitting by the radio announcing I'm sure Bemis made a professor at MIT. One says to the other, I'm not surprised, right from first grade he was a smart kid. Then said, that's right, that Bemis as he got older, he got so he knew more and more all the time. And I said, that's right, by this time that Bemis, he probably knows everything. And that's right, he may know everything, but he don't realize nothing. So there's
Yes.
a distinct difference
Yes.
between what you know
Yes.
and what you realize.
Yes.
And when it comes to actually doing things, what you realize plays a big part.
Mm-hmm. And I would tell the audience also that Secretary Shultz has a terrific autobiography that came out last year about leadership called Learning from Experience, which captures what you said there with the sentiment. But it is truly, it's a terrific, captures your life story, but also really closes in on the concept of leadership. So for those who are interested, certainly you can find that book. Do you feel that through your life experiences, when it comes to leadership, is humility, charity, compassion, those attributes, are they important to a good leader?
They're very important. But I think what you want to do is have a capacity to listen. Listening just isn't sitting there and somebody's talking. Listening is having the art of really trying to understand what the person is getting at.
Mm-hmm.
So listening carefully is very important.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And if you're going to be a good leader, you've got to be a good listener and surround yourself with people who are worth listening to.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And we feel when we think of leadership, there are many different forms of people like political leaders, economic leaders, business leaders, coaches, a lot of different people who will be held up as leaders. Do you feel that we don't talk enough about personal leadership, of how everyone on all levels, at whatever their station in life, do you feel that they have an opportunity to be leaders, to personally lead themselves or their situation?
Well, you want to be able to make a difference.
Mm.
I think it all starts in the family, as I was saying. And I have 5 children. I have 11 grandchildren. And I now have 5.5 great-grandchildren.
Wonderful.
So these little
Yes.
kids, they are so interested in
Yes.
everything. Their curiosity
Yes.
is unbounded.
Yes.
And they're more fun. And you can't help but say to yourself, what kind of a world are they going to inherit?
Yes.
And is there anything I can do to make it a little better?
Mm-hmm.
So that's my motivation in life.
That's wonderful. You also, on the side of when leadership fails, when do you feel a leader begins to fail? Whatever it is. Again, it could be a variety of manners in which an individual is leading. But when do they start to fail? Is it arrogance? Is it pride? Is it anger? What undermines leadership, and why does a leader fail?
Well, the one major leader I saw fail was Richard Nixon. And he was brilliant in many ways. People are so dominated by Watergate and they're thinking about him that they forget the many really constructive things that he did. But he had a dark side that somehow only a few people saw, but it wound up bringing him down.
Mm-hmm.
And it had to do with people losing the ability to trust him. And I think trust is the coin of the
Mm-hmm.
realm.
Mm-hmm. Do you think he himself, at the end, would have recognized that weakness in himself? Did he pay such a price that he was humbled by the experience, so much so that he said, well, perhaps it was my own weakness of it?
I don't know how
Yeah.
to answer that
Yeah.
question.
Yeah.
I know that he made a kind of semi-comeback in the sense of
Mm-hmm.
writing
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
and being influential from the sidelines.
Yes. So you finished your degree at Princeton, then you, from there, you went into the Marines, right? It was the
Right.
same year.
Yes.
So 1942.
Right, I just went from Princeton to the Marine Corps.
Yeah, and that's extraordinary. That's quite interesting. So you were in the Marines from 42 to 45,
Right.
and you went to the rank of captain while you were in the Marines, and
I
then
was a captain on active duty. Later in the reserves, I was promoted to major. So people in the Marines call me Major Shultz, and I don't recognize. I'm Captain Shultz, as far as I'm concerned.
Oh, Captain, my Captain. I'm fine calling you Captain or Secretary or the many other titles. Then from there you went to MIT and you received your PhD at MIT in economics.
Yes, but I learned a great deal in the Marine Corps.
Mm-hmm.
I remember the day the sergeant handed me my rifle. He said, take good care of this rifle. This is your best friend. And remember one thing. Never point this rifle at anybody unless you're willing to pull the trigger.
Hmm.
No empty threats.
Mm-hmm.
I told that story to President Reagan when I was Secretary of State. And you could notice we were very careful.
Mm-hmm.
And somebody would be in a meeting in the Situation Room and say, sometimes it's unacceptable. And he would say, well, what are you going to do? The answer is nothing. It is not acceptable. You accepted it. So be careful with your words. Mean what you say.
Yes.
And if you become known as somebody who does what you say you're going to do, then you're trusted.
Mm-hmm.
And you can be dealt with.
Mm-hmm.
Because trust in the end is the coin of the realm.
That's a wonderful
So I
metaphor.
learned that in the
Yes.
Marine Corps.
That's a wonderful metaphor and something. Who told you that? Was it your drill
The
sergeant?
drill
you said?
sergeant, when he hands me
That's
my
amazing.
rifle. I
What
think
a-
they do that all the time in boot camp in the
Yes.
Marine Corps.
Yes, that's a beautiful principle, and you told President Reagan that and he reacted favorably to it. It's such
Oh,
a
he liked it.
clear.
It was right down his
Yes,
alley.
yes. So you taught at MIT for a while, and then you taught at Chicago, and then from there you entered the Eisenhower administration. Yes.
No.
Oh.
I did my PhD at MIT, and they invited me to stay on in the faculty. And I was invited to be part of the Council of Economic Advisors in the Eisenhower administration. So I took a leave, and I did that for a year.
I see.
It was a very productive year from my standpoint. I learned a lot about the government.
Yes.
And my father was delighted because he came and visited my office. And it was in that old building.
Yes.
And I had a window that looked out on the south lawn of the White House.
Oh.
So he looked at that view, he said, son, you've arrived.
That's nice, and it was a proud moment, I'm sure, for you to be able to show your dad that experience. And did you meet in that experience? Did you meet President Eisenhower, or
I
had
met
you?
him, but of course I
Yes.
didn't.
Yes, you were
have
at
much
a
contact.
distance.
But Arthur Burns,
Yes.
who was the chairman, had lots of contact.
Mm-hmm.
So by a certain remove.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But I had a couple of instances with President Eisenhower that taught me a lot.
Mm-hmm.
In those days, people were worried about bombing, and we had drills,
Mm-hmm.
and everybody took part. And siren would go off. You'd go here, I'd go there, to
Mhm.
disperse the government,
Mm-hmm.
so we wouldn't all get wiped out. So one time, we're all called into a big room, and who should appear but President Eisenhower?
Mm.
And he said, we've been practicing a plan. You have to know that if something really happens, the plan is worthless. It's a point of departure. But reality is never what you think it might be. So you have to have the capacity to look at the reality and judge the reality and react.
Mm.
A very profound
Mhm.
statement.
Mm-hmm.
On another occasion, when I was named Secretary of Labor in 1968, I was told that if I wanted an appointment with him, he would see me. So I naturally made an appointment with him at Walter Reed Hospital in bed. He died about 4 or 5 months later. genial man. We started talking. I was astonished at how much he knew about the Department of Labor. And it dawned on me, if you're going to be effective up here, you've got to know what's going on down here.
Mm-hmm.
And he did.
Mm-hmm.
And so we talked about it. Then we started talking about golf.
Mm-hmm.
And he took me around the Augusta National Golf Club, and we were having a great time. And then a doctor came in and said, it's time to go. And all of a sudden, this genial man got very serious. He said, young man, you're going to come down here and you're going to work 12 hours a day, 7 days a week, and you're going to think you're doing your job. Let me tell you something. If that's what you do, there's no way you can do your job. You just burn yourself out.
Mm.
If you don't get out on some golf course at least twice a week and get your mind on something else, you won't be able to do your job.
Mm-hmm.
You have to give yourself a rest. The press will get after you, don't pay any attention to them. They don't know what it takes.
Yes. Yes.
But it was a very wise piece of
Yes.
advice.
Whether it's golf or some sort of
something-
walking or
If you
hiking.
just focus on one thing
Yes.
and very energetically, continuously,
Yes.
you're going to dry up.
Right. Yes, that's great advice, and from the man who planned the D-Day invasion, and that's wonderful advice. Tell me about your impressions. You've referred to President Reagan, and you worked so closely with him. You were friends, you were colleagues, but you knew each other well. The three people, your observations about President Reagan and his leadership qualities, and then Margaret Thatcher and Mikhail Gorbachev. The three individuals, how are they different, or what were your impressions? You worked so closely with each of them, more so with President Reagan. But.
The first time I had any real involvement with President Reagan was when I came back from having been Secretary of Labor, Director of the Budget, and Secretary of Treasury. I came back here to California. He was governor and invited me up to Sacramento for lunch. And I got a 2.5-hour grilling on how the federal government worked operationally. How do you put the budget together? What does the budget director do? What does the secretary do? What does the president do? How does the president know what's going on and find out how to make his mark on the budget? It was very operational. I came away saying to myself, you know, everybody says the man wants to be president, but from this conversation I see he wants to do the job. Just doesn't want to be. He has operationally wants to be involved and know how it works. So we had developed a kind of friendship out of that. We had fun.
Do you feel he was undervalued in that regard as an operational leader, as someone who was curious?
No, he was the governor of California. People often dismissed him as a movie actor. They forget he was governor for 8 years. It's a big state, in case you didn't know.
Yes.
A lot of complexity here.
Yes.
And so a governor sees a lot. So he had a lot.
Is it true that his public persona, he was a very strong character, but he also had a kindness about him? Is that true also?
He brought acorns back from Camp David to give to the squirrels on the White House lawn. And he had all those instincts. I was his economic advisor during the primaries and during the campaign and for the first part of his presidency before I was Secretary of State. So I knew him quite well. And he invited me to be Secretary of State over the telephone. I was in London, and I was a president of a company called Bechtel, big engineering company.
Yes.
And I get a phone call, and it's Judge Clark. He says, would you go over to our embassy and take on a secure line, take a call from the president? So I said yes, and we set a date. So I go over there, and he says to me, Al Haig has resigned, and his resignation has been accepted. I would like you to be Secretary of State. I said, Mr. President, you want me to accept this job over the phone? He said, yes, it's not a good idea to keep these open. And we know each other well, so
Yes.
we don't have to get acquainted.
Yes.
And so we discussed it some more. My wife was in town, and when I got the word that he wanted to talk to me, I told her, I don't know what he wants, but whatever it is, I probably have to say yes.
Yes.
He's the president.
Yes.
So I said yes. And then we took the plane the next day to Washington, and we were met by all the White House, Jim Baker and Ed Meese and Clark and whatever. And they said, there's a chopper here that will take you up to Camp David. There's a car here that can take your wife into town and she can find a hotel room. And I said, this is a package deal. Either we both go to the town and find a hotel room, we both go up to Camp David, take your choice.
Nicely done.
So we both went to Camp David, and
Yes.
Nancy was expecting my wife.
Yes.
So I said, so much for the White House staff.
Yes. Yes.
And so we started in there, and
That's a lovely story. You and your wife were so close and a partnership, and it goes back to what you were saying, the importance of family.
exactly.
Yeah, yeah. Margaret Thatcher?
She was really fun. Before I was in office, the president asked me to make a tour around to the leaders of the group of 7. And he said, I want to find out, not through ambassadors or bureaucracy, I want to find out what they think. And I want you to tell them what I think, person to person, like I'm there. So I went around and I go to London, and Margaret says, I'd like to, she knew everybody wanted to be in on everything, so she set a luncheon out in the British ambassador's place, what's the name, but anyway, the residence out of town. And so she invited everybody to lunch at 1, and she said, you come. Then I begin to get the nuance of the conversation. Then he looks at my, I said, have you ever had a good tour of Checkers, I guess it was? He said, no ma'am. He said, take him on a tour. So off they go, and she hooks her arm in me and takes me inside and to a reasonably small room with a nice fireplace and 2 chairs. And we sat there for 2 hours. And we went at it.
Yes.
And we argued and we talked and we had a great time. And I could see she didn't like doormats. She liked
Yes.
to engage.
Yes.
And so we did. And we formed a sort of a bond then.
Mm-hmm.
And we were able to work very effectively. Of
Wonderful.
course, she and President Reagan were
Yes.
close.
And you were a bridge.
Well, she would meet Gorbachev. I would meet Gorbachev. And we'd always compare notes. She'd always give us a report on what she saw in the Soviet Union and how it was going and so on.
I see.
And so that was really very helpful.
Yes. And then with Gorbachev, of course, you interacted with him and others around him. What were your impressions of him?
Well, I think the story of Gorbachev starts before that, because the Soviets had deployed intermediate-range nuclear weapons that could hit European targets, Japan and China, but not us. And the diplomatic ploy was, will we risk retaliation by their intercontinental missiles to provide deterrence for these? So we had a deal with NATO that we would have a negotiation, and if we couldn't get anywhere in the negotiation, we'd deploy our own intermediate-range missiles. And we had a negotiation. President Reagan, as a skillful negotiator, knew he wasn't just negotiating with the Soviet Union, he was negotiating with the European publics. Because if you're going to have a nuclear weapon deployed near where you are, that's a target.
Mm-hmm.
You're nervous.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, it was conducted, and finally it was clear we weren't getting anywhere. So we deployed cruise missiles in Britain with Margaret's help, and cruise missiles in Italy with Andreotti's help. But then the big deal was deploying ballistic missiles in Germany, which the Russians thought, the Soviets thought could reach Moscow. So the idea of Germany being able to wipe out Moscow was allergic. And they walked out of negotiations, they fanned war talk, they did everything they could to prevent it. And the alliance stood firm behind the Germans. I think Mitterrand made a special trip and made a speech to the Bundestag, but it was close and very tense. But we got them deployed. I thought it was Helmut Kohl's finest hour. He was Chancellor of Germany.
Did you feel Gorbachev was a trustworthy character? Was he a person?
He was not the General Secretary then. He was in the Politburo, but he was not. Somebody else was.
I see.
And so finally, as the months went on, things began to subside. And by August, the deployments, I think, were in November or December. By August the following year, I went to the President and said, Mr. President, at 4 different capitals in Europe, a Soviet diplomat has come up to one of ours and said virtually the same thing, which we think boils down to, if Gromyko is invited to Washington when he comes to the General Assembly in September, he'll accept. In other words, the Soviets blinked. I said, maybe you want to think it over, because Jimmy Carter canceled these meetings when they went into Afghanistan, and they're still there. Reagan said, I don't have to think it over. Let's get him here. So he came, and it was a giant event.
Yes.
And
yes.
After that, I had meetings with Gromyko the next January in Geneva, and we started the arms control negotiations, and things began to turn a corner. I always think that the turning point in the Cold War was the deployment of those Pershing missiles in Germany. This is all pre-Gorbachev. Then he comes on the scene, and I had met with him, and I had a meeting with Gromyko. Gorbachev started by trying to make it hard for people to get vodka. He thought they drank too much. He was right. But anyway, I had a big meeting with Gromyko in Venice, celebrating the Austrian treaty, and we had a long meeting. And then he said, well, what about the summit? I said, well, what about it? He said, well, you're invited to come to Moscow. I said, the last one was in Moscow. The next time is Washington. He said, well, how about we have this first one in Geneva? I said, I'll have to consult with my guy. Anyway, we then sat next to each other in dinner, and he's telling me about Gorbachev's effort to stop drinking. And I said, you have to be careful about street humor. What do you mean? I said, there's a story going around in Moscow that these two guys are standing in line at the vodka store. Half hour goes by, an hour goes by, and one of them says, I'm getting sick of this. I'm going over to the Kremlin and shoot Gorbachev. So he leaves. Half an hour later, he comes back. His buddy's moved up in line. He says, well, did you shoot him? He said, hell no, the line up there is a lot longer than this one. And Gromyko didn't laugh. Anyway,
that's awesome.
Gorbachev, my first time meeting him was when we went to Chernenko's funeral. And we were one of the last delegations to meet with him. But we had a lengthy meeting. And here he is, the new Secretary General. He'd been managing this huge event, people from all over the world seeing them. And he came and he looked fresh as a daisy. He had a stack of notes in front of him. He shuffled them around. He never looked at them. And he carried on a wide-ranging conversation. And it was a real conversation. Often in these things, you say something, it goes by my ear. I say something, it goes by your ear. It's not a conversation in the sense of response. Yes. But he was a conversationalist.
I see.
You could talk to him. And it was wide-ranging, obviously bright as a get out. Yes. Tough-minded, but really bright. I was very impressed. And afterwards, we went into a secure room at our embassy, and I said to our people, this is unlike any Soviet leader we've seen before. So I had, as Secretary of Treasury, I had lots of meetings. I knew they calibrated them. This is unlike any. He's very able, and he really converses. You can have a conversation with him. He's tough and all that. He's going to be a real adversary, but you can talk.
Did he grow to understand America a little bit more? Did he occasionally use English expressions or American colloquialisms, or did he refer to authors or anything like that?
The only time he referred to anything was that the Hoover Institution had published a book inaugurating the start of the Reagan administration. And I had something to do with it. It was a big, thick book. And he attacked me for something that was in that book.
Oh.
And I said, wow,
Yes.
it's worthwhile publishing.
Yeah.
It's read.
You feel that was a compliment of sorts. I wanted to point out for the audience that the work that you did that I think is often overlooked, but it's important to bring up as we talk about leadership, relates to what you did with Soviet Jews in the former Soviet Union. And I think your leadership there, along with others, but really your leadership in shepherding that reaction, secured a situation where more than 1 million Jews found freedom. And
we worked very hard on the
Yes.
issue of Soviet Jewry.
Yeah.
And on one occasion, I had a Passover dinner in the ambassador's residence. And afterwards, the next day, I had a meeting with Gorbachev, and he attacked me. He said, what do you do? You're always talking to those lousy Jews. I said, if you don't like them, they're lousy Jews, I have a deal for you. I got a big airplane out there in the airport. Just load them all on the airplane, and I'll take them to someplace I know they'll be welcome. So he changed the subject. But anyway, gradually, he and Shevardnadze came around. And on one occasion, I had a meeting with Shevardnadze, and I wanted what I said to be taken down carefully by their note takers, and maybe it would get into the Kremlin. And so I made the argument that we're living in an information age. It's a new age. And if you run a country that's compartmented and isolated, you're going to lose out. So you've got to open up more and let people emigrate, for instance. And Gorbachev later told me that it did get into the Kremlin. I read it out. I wrote it out, which I didn't usually do. And then I read it very slowly so that note takers could take it down.
Interesting.
And it made a difference.
It truly did. And think all the strangers who may have been impacted by that, the children, the grandchildren, now the great-grandchildren. It's really extraordinary what you did there. And I know that you've been influential in creating diversity with universities from a very early part of your career, African Americans and business programs.
At the University of Chicago, when I was dean, we had a downtown program that was for people who were working and they could come at night. And we had quite a few people of color in that program, but on campus there were none. And it wasn't because we declined, nobody applied. And so I made a tour of black colleges and places where there are big black communities. And I asked about it, and I got the same answer everywhere. Number one, it's too expensive. Number two, we don't see there's any job there at the end. So I went around to companies whose names were familiar, like Exxon, was then Esso. And I got them to put up scholarships for these people, and also to say that between their first and second year that summer, they guaranteed a job. So you would get a job somewhere and get a feel for it. There wasn't any guarantee on anybody's part that they'd get a job at the end or that they would take it, but they had a summer job. So that made a dent, and we started getting good applications, and it worked.
Yes, and I raised those two issues, and there are so many more, but again, as an illustration of your leadership, many people will know you in these positions of Secretary of State, Secretary of Treasury, etc., and yet you're displaying leadership on all levels in a variety of ways. That is what you did in both those instances, is compassionate, it's visionary, it's thoughtful. And so let me ask you about your Secretary of Treasury, OMB Director, and as we look at the defense budget now, it's approaching $700 billion, the total defense budget. And of course, during the Reagan administration, there was a significant buildup of the military, even a retooling of the military to position, and that's critical, and that was critically important. And obviously, the military budget is a critical portion of our national security. Do you feel at any point that the military budget, from your OMB perspective, your academic perspective, can grow too large? Can it grow so large that it overshadows the ability of the diplomatic side, the softer side of national security, of diplomacy and development? Does it have that potential?
I don't feel that the diplomatic side is softer. It's different.
Yes.
But if you don't have strength, you're going to get your head handed to you in negotiations. So I fully supported the strong military presence. But you have to distinguish between force and strength. Strength is what you want. The use of force doesn't necessarily give you strength. If you use it and it isn't successful, you deprive yourself of strength. I think our Afghanistan war that's going on right now deprives us of strength because we've poured huge amounts of resources in and we're not getting anywhere. So it shows that we're not strong.
Does it tie back to your metaphor with your first sergeant, your drill sergeant?
A little bit, but also I'll remember when President Reagan was first in office, the air traffic controllers went on strike. And he said, they took an oath of office, they violated it, they're out. Principal position. And all over the world people said, is the man crazy? These are the guys who keep the planes flying. But having been governor of California, he understood the importance of being able to execute. He had a man as Secretary of Transportation who had been chief executive of a large transportation company, and he understood the problem. And working with the president, they manned the towers with management people. They got some help from the military, I believe. They had a very aggressive recruiting and training program, and they kept the planes flying. And all over the world people said, watch your step, the guy plays for keeps. So that was strength. No force, strength. Strength is what you want.
Yes.
You'll notice that in the Reagan period, we very seldom used force.
Yes. And as Secretary of State, what you are particularly known for as Secretary is your reliance on the institutional professionalism, and specifically related to the Foreign Service. The Foreign Service itself, I think when you came in, you had a great reliance on perhaps your academic background, but you had a real reliance on language ability, area studies, and relying on
these are obviously important things.
Yes.
But if I knew something about it, I'd had 3 cabinet positions where I was Secretary of State, so you interact a little and you know what the career people are like. They're always good. They're there, they came to serve. They're smart. They've had a lot of experience to learn, so they're a valuable resource. It just makes sense. And from my standpoint, they would follow a lead if it were done in a professional, sensible way. I remembered when I became Secretary of Labor, I was told that it was an impossible job for a Republican because the department was a wholly owned subsidiary of the AFL-CIO.
Okay.
And I got a first-class bunch of people in, and we gave them professional leadership. They knocked themselves out for us. And I became good friends with George Meany, so that helped. But anyway, I found that in OMB and the Treasury, the career people, they know a lot. They've been there. They've had experience. So you draw on it.
Yes.
And the same in the State Department. And there were sensational people there. My chief assistant was first Ray Seitz, who was a Foreign Service officer, and then Charlie Hill. And they were both superb. And they helped me a great deal.
Roz Ridgway, you've spoken
Roz
about.
was,
yes.
It was an interesting thing with Roz. Well, I forgot just when it was, in the mid-'80s. I have a new assistant secretary for Europe, which was the person that would be the person I would be working with to deal with the Soviet Union, so it was a very important post. So I worked at it very hard to figure out who would be the best person I could find. And I decided the best person was Roz Ridgway. And I went over it carefully with the president, and he agreed. We put our nomination up. Nothing happened. Then we started getting notices from the Senate saying, are you planning to withdraw this nomination? And we said no. And they said, this is a very important job, and it's very difficult, and a woman can't do this job. And President Reagan was pretty sly about the way he did things. We talked it over, and he let it just sort of leak out that he was thinking of making a public speech calling on the Senate to give her a vote and stand up and be counted. And if you want to vote against her because she's a woman, help yourself, but stand up and be counted. So right away she got confirmed.
Wow.
So he pulled that off.
Yeah, and she was such an extraordinary
She was
officer.
wonderful, but
yeah, that's
I
amazing.
still had trouble,
Yes.
particularly in the DOD. And there was a very talented guy there named Richard Pearl, who I knew and liked, but
Yes.
he was called the Prince of Darkness, and he was very skeptical.
Yes.
So we go over to Geneva for the first big summit between Reagan and Gorbachev. And Reagan took the position they didn't want any pre-negotiated communique. Because if you do that, the staffs negotiate this thing and they have brackets, and then the leaders wind up talking about the brackets. So that's not a meeting of leaders, it's a meeting of staff. So he wouldn't have a pre-negotiated communique, which meant that Roz was going to do the all-nighter to produce something at the end of the summit. So Richard said, I'd like to be on the delegation. And I said to him, okay, but you have to give me your word that Roz is 100% totally in charge. You don't say a word unless she wants you to. So he agreed. So the meeting went off much better than anybody thought it would. And so the last meeting was on the Soviet grounds, and I'm standing with Gorbachev, Roz is there, and the Soviet staff people are there, and we're seeing President Reagan off. And then I start having deliberately a conversation with Gorbachev about what happened. In other words, I was trying to describe the communique. And so then Nancy Reagan gives a dinner. Nancy knew how to throw a party. And it was fun. Everybody was feeling pretty good because the meeting went well. And all of a sudden I get a phone call. This is when we're back and having coffee and brandy and so on. It's Roz. She said, I've been sitting here for 4 hours, and these people act like they never heard what you and Gorbachev were talking about. They're just back in the old Cold War. And I'm just standing here. I just want you to know. I said, hold in. So I go back, and then somebody asked me about the phone call. So I unload on Gorbachev. What's the matter? Don't your people's pay any attention to you? And so Nancy was mad because I disrupted her dinner party. But anyway, Roz hung in, and I guess about 1 o'clock in the morning they got new instructions.
Wow.
And out of it
Wonderful
came
story.
the best statement we ever got.
Yes.
And we didn't even call it a communique. We called it a joint statement to differentiate it. And Pearl afterwards came to me and he said, Roz Ridgway is the toughest, most skillful negotiator I have ever experienced. Anytime I can be on her team, let me know. So that was the end of it.
She's still around. She's quite extraordinary. She's a real patriot. With the Foreign Service itself as the professional diplomatic service for our country, I don't think Americans realize how small it is. The professional career Foreign Service right now at State Department is about 13,700 people. And then if we add in USAID and Department of Agriculture and
It's
Commerce,
often said that the number of people in military bands
yes,
is about the size of the State Department.
right.
But we get our money's worth out of it.
And so it's about 15,500 people. And I think Americans need to recognize that how few, the very talented, skillful individuals, and yet we have so few. Do you feel that the American people would support, or should a leader step forward and say, we need to grow the Foreign Service? We need to, much along the lines of, as we look at the military budget, do we have enough people? Well, does our country have enough professional diplomats, and could we grow it, even modestly, 1,000 or 2?
I felt when I was in office that we were all right, but it was very important, and I paid a lot of attention to the incoming people, because you want to get able people coming in and then see that they get experiences that grow them.
Mm-hmm.
And that experience is a very important part of it.
Mm-hmm.
But also, I remember once early on, people knew that I had a university background, and so they started telling me about the Foreign Service Institute and how great it was.
Yes.
And I expressed it and said, well, they'll come over and tell you. I said, no, I want to go there and see them. So I went over, and they were in some office building across the river. And it was good and all that, but I said to myself, this setting sends a message that we don't think this is very important.
Mm-hmm.
And so I scratched my head about that. And I forget, it was the Army or somebody had an intelligence unit across the Potomac, a piece of ground, and they were leaving it. So we lobbied to get it, and we got it assigned to us. And then we got some money, and I somehow put a big circle around it so it couldn't be used for anything else. And we got it fixed up to our liking as a training place. And it turned out very well.
And now, of course, it's named after you for those efforts in honor of what you did.
Yeah, but I think it sends the right message
Yes.
that training and
Yes.
developing yourself
Yes.
is really important.
We have a situation now where there's been a freeze with hiring, that there's a lack of reliance on the professional foreign service for their expertise, but aside from that, hiring younger people, bringing them in who are very, even at Stanford here, there are many students who want to enter the foreign service or serve their country. And
Yeah, I frequently have students come in to see me, and they say, I'm interested in public service, and particularly I'm interested in doing something that has international in scope. So I tell them about the Foreign Service, and they've heard of it usually. And I say, well, there's an exam you take.
Mm-hmm.
And if you qualify, then you get brought into the Foreign Service. And there is somebody called the director, and the job of that person is to develop the Foreign Service. And that person will see that you get moved around to places that will develop your talents. And they also, as a great language school, you have to learn languages.
Mm-hmm.
If you go to some other country and you don't know the language, you're lost.
Yes.
You have to know the language.
Yes. And potentially, do you see a situation where we create a little bit more room in the 150 account for the creation of new positions as a vision for our country to create more diplomatic positions or development professionals to execute our interests overseas? Could there be a situation, because right now we're freezing the hiring of foreign
Well, I
service.
should think we'd want to maintain the flow, and I haven't been there in 25 years,
Yes.
so wouldn't make a.
Yes.
But I do think that you have to bring people in and give them the training and the experience,
Mm-hmm.
and then you get what you want.
So you talked about...
We had a big debate in the Reagan period that people I don't think, perhaps didn't even know it was going on, but the Foreign Service played an important role for me in it. I had been Secretary of the Treasury, and one of my jobs was trying to work on the economic relationship between the Soviet Union and the United States. So I had been to Moscow quite a few times, and I can remember once President Nixon lifted the embargo on them buying grain. And they bought a little bit here and a little bit there. Before anybody woke up, they'd cornered the market. So I went over and I met with Kosygin, who was the number 2 guy. I said, here's what happened. He said, I know that. I said, it's unacceptable. He said, I've figured that out. I said, if you want to keep access to our market, we have to work out a way of doing it. And the way of doing it is we have to know how much you're going to buy. Like everybody else, information is the key. So we worked out what became the basis for the long-term grain agreement. But at any rate, one of the things that I got the CIA to study, they photographed how much was planted and what were the yields. And they took that over to the agricultural people, and they were appalled. The Soviet farming was bankrupt. It was terrible, their yields.
Mm-hmm.
And then my late wife was a nurse, and she would be always invited to go to hospitals and things. And she could hardly wait to get out. She said, I can't believe these places. They're not clean. And so I knew their health system was not that
Mm-hmm.
good.
Mm-hmm.
And my meetings with my counterparts led me to feel they understood their economy is not that good. Right now, for example, the Russian economy is not as big as Italy's, and they have twice as many people and huge resources, so they're not managing themselves well.
Mm-hmm.
So I knew all that. So I felt that detente was not a good idea. Detente says, we're here, they're there, that's life. The name of the game is to get along. I thought, and President Reagan thought, that we're here, they're there, but they're not stable. And if we work at it right, they'll change.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And that it makes a big difference what your attitude is.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
The CIA people, the DOD people all thought detente.
Mm-hmm.
President Reagan and I thought otherwise.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I learned this in an odd way because I came back from a trip to China. I landed at Andrews Air Force Base on a Friday morning. I was lucky to land. It was snowing. And it snowed all day Friday. It snowed Friday night. It snowed Saturday morning. So the Reagans were stuck in the White House. They couldn't go to Camp David or anything. And our phone rings. It's Nancy. She says, how about coming over and having supper with us? So my wife and I go over to the White House, and the four of us are sitting around having a nice time. And all of a sudden, they start asking me about the Chinese leaders. And President Reagan, I was always interested in the person. And what are they like? Do they have a sense of humor? Can you find their bottom line? What kind of people are they? Then they knew I dealt with the Soviets, so they started asking me about them. And I'm sitting there, and it's dawning on me, this man has never had a real conversation with a big-time communist leader. And he's dying to have one.
Mm-hmm.
And I had, with some effort, managed to have weekly meetings with Ambassador de Brennan.
Mm-hmm.
And the announced reason was to get weeds out before they grow up. There's a little weed, let's get it out. We
Yes.
don't need unnecessary problems.
Yes.
So I said, Ambassador de Brennan's coming over next Tuesday at 5 o'clock. What if I bring him over here and you can talk to him? And President Reagan, I could see he and Nancy had talked this over. He said, that'd be great. He said, it'll only take about 10 minutes. But all I want to ask him, if his new leader, Andropov had just succeeded Brezhnev, if his new leader is interested in a constructive conversation, I'm ready. That was a thunderbolt of news.
Mm.
So I knew what his attitude was, his gut feeling was.
Mm-hmm.
So I bring de Brennan over, and we were there for at least an hour and a half. We talked about all kinds of subjects. I'm sure de Brennan was impressed with how conversant the president was with the details of arms control things. But he spent a lot of his time talking about Soviet Jewry. And it wasn't generalization. He had names and specific events and so on.
Mm-hmm.
And then he talked about the Pentecostals who had rushed into our embassy in the Carter administration. They were still there.
Mm-hmm.
And you couldn't expel them because they'd probably be killed.
Mm-hmm.
But it was very uncomfortable. And he pointed out, he says, it's like a big neon sign you have in Moscow saying you don't treat people decently. Don't let them worship the way they want. You don't let them emigrate. And you ought to do something about it.
Mm-hmm.
And he said, I just want something to happen. I won't say a word. I just want it to happen. So riding back in the car, de Brennan and I said, let's make that our special project. And we exchanged pieces of paper back and forth. And finally I got one that I thought looked promising. And I took it over to the president. And I said, Mr. President, if you call in lawyers, they'll tell you they can drive a truck through the holes in this memo. But I have to believe, with all the background of this, if we get them to leave the cemetery, they'll be allowed to go home and eventually immigrate. So we rolled the dice. We got them out. They were allowed to go home. And then they were allowed to immigrate. All their families, there were 50 or 60 people. It was a giant event.
Yes.
And Reagan said nothing. And the Soviets knew how tempting it was for an American politician to say, look what I did. He said nothing.
Mm.
I always felt it was important because he saw you could make a deal with them and they'd carry it out.
Yes.
And they saw the same thing.
Yes.
So it
Yes.
laid a groundwork.
Yes, and he...
But this
yes.
argument about whether they could change or not it dragged on for a long time.
Mm-hmm.
And finally they did change, and there it was.
Yes. And he truly, President Reagan was a person of faith. He believed that we can do things in this life, but perhaps it's recorded elsewhere, yes?
Maybe.
Yep. You referred to your your beautiful children who are now out in the world and established, and your 11 grandchildren, 5.5 grandchildren, you said?
Yeah, I have 5, and then
Five.
another granddaughter-in-law is pregnant.
Ah, lovely. And I'm sure many students are coming to you all the time looking for advice and thoughts, and you've had this trajectory of, we started talking about growing up in New Jersey and New York, and so you are a person of real wisdom, or really truly a leader. What do you say to younger people, both your family but also younger people? Is there hope? Is there a better time to come? What's your general advice that you give to younger people about leadership and just life?
I think you want to have a good family, and you want to make a difference somehow, in some way, be a contributor.
Mm-hmm.
And I think people talk about public service as though it's a big sacrifice. I say it's not a sacrifice, it's a privilege. And you learn tremendously by public service. So I spent a good proportion of my life between the Marine Corps and the Council of Economic Advisors and the various in public service, and I feel it was a high point of my life.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a good thing to do.
Mm-hmm.
But you can serve. I was riding with in an airplane with one of these guys who was a big dealer around here in Silicon Valley, and he was talking about giving back. And I said, why are you talking about giving back? You've created this company, and it's a big success because it's doing something for people. Mm-hmm. So don't say giving back, say doing more. Mm-hmm. He didn't like the idea, but
yes, that's
anyway, I think there are all kinds of ways of serving.
Yes, and you truly have been such a wonderful leader, and I do so value taking time with you, because I feel the voice that we're capturing here today is something that I hope people listen to over time, and because you have genuinely been a leader, not perfect, we're all imperfect, but you really have been an example to so many, and so on behalf of many people, thank you for taking time and capturing your thoughts, and I do appreciate it.
Thank you.
We appreciate your listening. Please go to clydebuiltnow.org for more information, or visit us on our Facebook page at Clydebuilt International. Thank you.